This is the story of the Aviastar Mandirini BAE 146 crash. On the 9th of April 2009, a BAE 146 was on the ground at Sentani Airport in Indonesia. It was flying to Wamena Airport in Papua. On that day, there were 2 pilots, a cargo loadmaster, 2 flight attendants, and an engineer on board. The plane took off from Sentani and headed for Wamena Airport. At first, the plane was in IFR, or instrument flight rules, but there were no instrument approaches into Wamena. So they switched to visual rules as they got closer to Wamena. As the pilots approached Wamena, they saw that the clouds were low to the ground, in and around the airport. As the plane flew over the hilly terrain of Wamena, the pilots got a terrain warning. Once the pilots had lined up with the runway, they let ATC know that they had the runway in sight. But the approach did not look right. The captain couldn't get the plane to where he wanted it to be. So he said, "We are overshooting." Right as he said that, they got a sink rate warning telling them that they were descending way too fast for this approach. The sink rate warning quickly changed to a whoop whoop, pull up. This is basically the plane telling the pilots to pull up and climb away due to terrain conflicts ahead. The first officer shouted, "Overshoot, overshoot," asking the captain to go around. So the pilots decided to go around. As the BAE 146 went around, the pilots stayed on the extended centerline for a bit. The controller gave them 2 options. They could either land on runway 33 or they could land back on runway 15. The pilots, they chose runway 15. The pilots then began a turn to the right to get on the downwind leg of the circuit. The pilots were talking among themselves about the best way to get back to the runway. From the ground, the plane was hidden from view as the clouds around Wamena swallowed the aircraft. The BAE 146 was low to the ground as it flew around the circuit back to runway 15, using visual references to make sure that they were making the turn correctly. The first officer said, "Okay, river in sight," and said Pike Hill in sight as he saw important landmarks on the approach. The BAE 146 continued to turn in order to line up towards the runway. The first officer said, "Be careful, sir." A third voice in the cockpit added, "There's a hill on the left." Their remarks quickly grew into genuine concern as a hill appeared right in front of them. The pilots immediately pushed all 4 engines to max power. The 4 engines responded as fast as they could, and the captain put the plane into a left bank in order to avoid the mountain that was right in front of them. The automated warning in the cockpit screamed, "Don't sink, don't sink." But as the bank of the plane grew more and more extreme, the nose dropped. The first officer was now saying, "Don't sink." The first officer called for another left turn in order to avoid the mountains, but the nose of the plane was dropping. The captain was flooded with warnings. Some of them said too low terrain, others said bank angle, and a final one said terrain. The BAE 146 slammed into a mountain, going 146 knots in a left-hand bank. None of the 6 people on board survived. The wreck of the plane was situated 3.55 nautical miles from the runway at Wamena Airport, and a post-impact fire destroyed the wreck. The investigators were able to ascertain that the plane was in one piece and that it wasn't on fire before impact, which just left one question on everyone's minds. If the runway was over there, how did the plane end up all the way over here? The first bit of clue came from the flight data recorder. After their altitude ranged between 150 to 350 feet. Now usually when you go around, you stabilize your plane at an altitude that's usually in the thousands, not hundreds. So this plane was way lower than it should have been, even before it got to the mountains. This is evidenced by the multiple terrain warnings that they got when they were on their way to line up with runway 15 a second time. This also told the investigators that the terrain avoidance warnings on the plane were working as intended. The only hitch was that these pilots were ignoring them. The terrain warnings had no effect on these pilots. They just went about the approach business as usual. The same exact thing happened on the right-hand turn towards the runway. They were low and they were banking the plane way too aggressively. Again, they got a multitude of warnings, which they promptly ignored. As the approach progressed, the tone of the first officer changed. It was obvious that he was concerned about the way the captain was flying their plane. It wasn't just the first officer. The unknown third person in the cockpit was also concerned about the way the captain was flying. They were really concerned about the mountains in their way, but the captain stayed firm to his approach. Despite the concerns of the first officer, the captain did nothing to fly a safer approach. Usually in situations like these, the GPWS, or the ground proximity warning system, or the automation, fails in some way, causing the pilots to get too low to the ground. But in this situation, that's not the case. The pilots put the plane into a dangerous situation. The systems worked as intended, and they warned the captain about what he was doing. But there's only so much that an automated system can do if the pilot does not heed its warnings. The investigators started looking into the pilots. They looked at their training and found that the flight crew operations manual wasn't very clear about what to do in case of a don't sink warning. It stated that the pilots needed to adjust the flight path as required, which isn't very helpful advice. But none of that really mattered, as they found out that neither pilot had gotten the GPWS training that was specified in the company's training manual. The thing is, this crew was violating company operating manuals way before they even got near to the runway. The way they flew the plane around the airport was not in conformance with the company's operating manual. This meant that by the time that they were in trouble, they just didn't know how to react correctly to the warnings. The sad thing is that had the captain actually listened to those warnings, then this accident would not have occurred. The report does not mince words when it comes to stating why this crash happened. Here's a quote. "The flight crew's disregard of the published procedures bypassed the safety criteria and inbuilt risk treatments in the design of these procedures. That disregard directly contributed to the development of the occurrence." End quote. Now, I have my own personal theory on why the pilots ignored the warnings. This is pure speculation on my part. But that part of the world is hilly, and it's not unusual to get a few terrain warnings on your way into an airport. So a pilot who is used to flying in areas like this might get desensitized to terrain warnings. In their minds, it stops being such a huge deal. After all, things worked out many times before. Why should this time be any different? I mean, there have been cases of flight crews pulling circuit breakers because they got sick and tired of hearing the same warning over and over again. Do you think that these pilots got too complacent? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. After this crash, the Indonesians made quite a few changes to Aviastar Mandirini. They were required to fix the inconsistencies in their training manuals, and they were required to put more emphasis on crew coordination in training. They were also required to overhaul the simulator for the BAE 146 with more training on how to react to GPWS warnings. I guess this accident made our skies just a tad bit safer in the end. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.